I still remember the cold. That's one of the things they don't tell you about Korea. How the cold gets into your bones, settles there like it's making a home. November 1950, Chosin Reservoir. Temperature dropping to 30 below zero. The kind of cold where your breath freezes in front of your face, where rifle bolts would freeze shut if you didn't keep them moving. I was 22 years old, just a kid from Ohio who'd never seen mountains like that before. Sergeant James Conley, United States Marine Corps. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Been in country about 4 months by then. Young enough to still believe I was invincible, old enough to know better. They called us the Frozen Chosen. Gallows humor, I guess. But there we were, surrounded by Chinese troops who had entered the war just weeks earlier, caught in a freezing hellscape where the ground was too hard to dig foxholes without explosives. Every day was about survival, against the enemy, against the cold, against your own mind telling you to just lie down and close your eyes in the snow. I'd written to my girl back home just the day before it happened. Her name was Catherine. Katie, I called her. Dark hair, smile that lit up rooms. We'd been sweethearts since high school. I told her about how beautiful the mountains were when the sun hit them just right, how I'd never seen stars so bright as in the Korean night sky. I didn't tell her about the frostbite cases, the constant fear, the men who'd already died. What was the point? She'd only worry more. You compartmentalize in war. You have to. The man you are back home gets folded up neatly and tucked away. The man you become on the battlefield is different. Harder, focused on the immediate. Survival. Looking out for your buddies. Following orders. Everything else is a distraction that could get you killed. My squad had been together since training. 8 of us left by then. Harrison, our barman, quiet guy from Kentucky who could shoot the wings off a fly. Miller, our radio operator, always carrying those extra 20 pounds of equipment, never complained once. Rodriguez, best damn scout I ever knew, could sense enemy movement before anyone else. Jackson, Thompson, O'Neill, and Kowalski. Brothers, all of them. Not by blood, but by something deeper. We'd been dug in along a ridgeline for 3 days. Sporadic fire exchanges with Chinese patrols. Nothing major yet, but we all knew it was coming. Intelligence said there were thousands of Chinese troops massing north of our position. But intelligence had been wrong before, underestimating their numbers, their willingness to fight in conditions that seemed inhuman. That night before, we huddled in our makeshift foxholes, passing around a single cigarette because the wind was too strong to light more than one at a time. Harrison had this little metal flask of bourbon he'd been saving. Said his daddy gave it to him before he shipped out. Told him to save it for when he really needed it. That night, he decided we all needed it. To getting home, he said, passing it to me first. I took a sip, felt the burn all the way down. To getting home, I echoed and passed it to Miller. Around the circle it went, each man repeating those words like a prayer. Like if we said it enough times, it would have to come true. When it got back to Harrison, he took the last sip, then tucked the empty flask back into his pocket. My old man's gonna be pissed I didn't bring this back full, he said with a grin. We all laughed, quiet enough not to draw attention. It was a good moment. One of those moments of clarity in the midst of madness. Lieutenant Walsh came by around 2200 hours checking positions. Young guy, maybe a year older than me, but with eyes that looked ancient. West Point graduate. Good officer, cared about his men. Anything unusual, Sergeant? He asked, hunkering down next to me. No, sir. All quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He nodded. Battalion's getting reports of movement 3 clicks north. Large formations. Could be they're preparing something big. We're ready, sir. I said, not entirely sure if it was true. Get some rest if you can, Conley. I have a feeling tomorrow's going to be a long day. I didn't know then how prophetic those words would be. How could I? None of us knew what was coming. If we had, well, I don't know what we would have done differently. Probably nothing. We were Marines. We had our orders. We had each other. I managed maybe 2 hours of sleep that night in 20-minute increments. That's how we did it. One man always awake, rotating through the night. The cold made real sleep impossible anyway. Your body just wouldn't let go completely, always fighting to maintain enough warmth to stay alive. First light came gray and grudging around 6:30. Mist hanging in the valleys below us, mountains looming like silent judges all around. Beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. I remember thinking that if I survived this war, I'd never complain about Ohio winters again. Breakfast was cold sea rations. Ham and lima beans for me. We called it ham and motherfuckers. Eaten quickly with fingers so numb I could barely feel the metal can. Coffee made with melted snow, heated over a tiny sterno flame. just enough to take the ice off it. The attack began at 0745. No warning, no gradual buildup, just the sudden hammering of artillery falling all around us. The air filled with dirt and snow and shrapnel. Then the bugles, God, those bugles. Chinese officers using them to coordinate their troops. A sound I still hear in my nightmares sometimes, shrill and alien in that frozen landscape. Incoming! Take cover! Lieutenant Walsh's voice somehow cutting through the chaos. We didn't need to be told. We were already pressing ourselves into whatever protection our positions offered, returning fire as waves of Chinese troops emerged from the tree line below us. Hundreds of them, moving in that strange formation they used. Groups advancing while others provided covering fire, leapfrogging forward in human waves. Harrison's bar was hammering away beside me, the steady thump of it almost reassuring amidst the madness. I fired my M1, 8 rounds, eject the clip, reload, 8 more rounds. Mechanical, rhythmic. No time to think about what I was doing, who I was killing. Just aim, fire, reload. Aim, fire, reload. They're flanking left, Rodriguez shouted. Sergeant, they're getting around the left side. I turned to see what he meant, and sure enough, a group of maybe 30 Chinese soldiers had found a draw on the ridgeline. Were working their way up toward our position from the northeast. Miller, get battalion on the radio. Tell them we need support. Jackson, Thompson, shift left, concentrate fire on that draw. Don't let them get established up here. Miller was hunched over the radio, trying to raise someone, anyone. No response, Sarge. I think the antenna took a hit. Keep trying, I shouted back, then turned to handle the immediate threat. The next hours blurred together in that strange way that combat has of both stretching time and compressing it. Moments of intense clarity, seeing a Chinese soldier's face clearly through my rifle sights, watching him fall, the ping of my empty clip ejecting, the smear of blood on Miller's cheek from a near miss, interspersed with fuzzy periods where I was operating on pure instinct and training. By midday, we'd held our position, but at a cost. Thompson was dead, killed by a grenade that landed right in his foxhole. O'Neill was badly wounded, a bullet through his thigh that missed the artery, but left him unable to move on his own. We'd pulled him back behind the line, done what we could with morphine and bandages. Rodriguez had a nasty gash across his scalp from shrapnel, but head wounds bleed like crazy even when they're not serious. He was still fighting. The Chinese had pulled back for the moment, but we could see them regrouping below. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ammo check, I called out. The responses weren't good. Most of us were down to our last few clips. Harrison had maybe 1 belt left for the BAR. We hadn't been resupplied in 2 days. What's the word from battalion? I asked Miller. He shook his head. Finally got through. They're pinned down too. Everyone is. They're trying to get air support, but the weather's too shit for planes. They said to hold as long as we can, then fall back to the secondary position if necessary. I knew what that meant. We were on our own. Maybe not abandoned, but close enough. The secondary position was nearly a mile south, and getting there would mean crossing open ground under fire. With O'Neill wounded, our ammo low, it would be a fighting retreat at best, a slaughter at worst. We hold, I said, making the decision. We hold until dark, then reassess. No one argued. They knew as well as I did that moving now would be suicide. The second attack came around 1400 hours. This time they hit us from 3 sides simultaneously. They'd learned from the morning, found the weak points in our perimeter, and they had machine guns set up now. Russian-made, probably, heavy caliber that chewed through our meager cover like it was paper. Get down! I screamed as the first burst swept across our position. Most of us were already as low as we could get, pressed into the frozen earth like we were trying to become part of it. Harrison's bar opened up again, laying down suppressive fire toward the main thrust of the attack. I shifted right, trying to target the machine gun that was causing us the most grief. It was dug in behind a rock outcropping, just the barrel and occasionally the gunner's helmet visible. 5 rounds left in my clip. I waited for the gunner to shift position, saw the movement, took my shot. Missed. 4 rounds. Breathe. Focus. Another movement. I squeezed the trigger twice, rapid succession. The machine gun fell silent momentarily. Whether I'd hit the gunner or just made him duck, I couldn't tell. Car! A grenade! Kowalski's voice urgent and terrified. I turned to see the small oval shape land in our midst, rolling to a stop near where Miller was still working the radio. Time slowed down. I saw every detail. The serrated surface of the grenade, The fear in Miller's eyes as he saw it too. The way the light caught the metal. Kowalski lunged for it. 21 years old, kid from Chicago, who talked about becoming a carpenter when he got home. He grabbed the grenade, turned to throw it back. Too late. The explosion lifted him off his feet, threw him backward like a broken doll. Miller was knocked flat by the concussion. I felt something hot sting my face. Realized later it was shrapnel and bits of... I don't like to think about what else it might have been. Man down. I heard someone shout. Might have been me, might have been Rodriguez. Doesn't matter. Kowalski was gone. Nothing anyone could have done. The attack intensified. They sensed our weakness now, pressed harder. The machine gun I thought I'd silenced opened up again, sweeping back and forth across our position. Harrison's bar fell silent. Out of ammo, finally. He switched to his sidearm, a .45 that would be useless at anything but the closest range. Running low, Sarge, Jackson called out, holding up his last clip. Make them count, I shouted back. I was down to my last clip, too. 8 rounds between me and using my combat knife. Not good odds. I saw Lieutenant Walsh moving among the men further down the line, redistributing what little ammo was left, encouraging, leading. Good man. Too good for this frozen hell. The minutes stretched. Chinese troops were getting closer now, emboldened by our diminishing fire. I could see their faces clearly. Young, most of them. Not so different from us, really. Just men following orders, fighting someone else's war. I dropped 2 more with careful shots, then turned to check on Miller. He was back on the radio, blood seeping through his parka where shrapnel had caught him, but still functioning. Any luck? I asked. Maybe, he said, voice tight with pain. Battalion says they've got a fire mission approved. Artillery might be able to hit the main force below us. ETA 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Might as well be 5 years when you're being overrun. But it was something to hold on to. Hear that? I called to the others. Artillery coming in 5. Hold on. I don't know if they believed it would come in time. I'm not sure I did. But sometimes hope is all you have. The machine gun shifted its fire toward the left flank, where Jackson and Rodriguez were still putting up resistance. I saw my chance and took it, changing position quickly to get a better angle on the gunner. 3 rounds left. I took a breath, steadied my aim, and fired. The machine gun fell silent again. This time I saw the gunner slump forward over his weapon. A good shot, maybe the best shot of my life. But there were too many others coming up behind him. They're through on the left. Rodriguez shouted. I turned to see Chinese troops pouring over the edge of our position, engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Jackson and Rodriguez. More were coming. Fall back to the secondary position. Lieutenant Walsh's order cut through the chaos. Controlled withdrawal. Conley, get your men moving. It was the right call, even if it came too late. Staying meant certain death for all of us. At least a fighting withdrawal gave us some chance. Miller, Harrison, grab O'Neill. Jackson, Rodriguez, covering fire. Move, move, move! I fired my last 2 rounds toward the advancing Chinese, then slung my rifle and drew my .45. Not much, but better than nothing. Miller and Harrison hoisted O'Neill between them, started moving back as Jackson and Rodriguez laid down what little fire they had left. I moved with them, walking backward, firing my pistol when any target presented itself. We'd made it maybe 50 yards when the world exploded around us. The promised artillery finally arriving, shell after shell impacting the Chinese positions, throwing dirt and snow and bodies into the air. Some landed dangerously close to us. Friendly fire isn't always friendly. Keep moving, I shouted over the thunder of the impacts. We had to get to the secondary position, regroup with whatever was left of our company, hope for resupply. I didn't see the machine gun that got me. Must have been set up during the confusion. Or maybe it had been there all along, and I just missed it. I just remember the sudden hammer blow that hit me, like being kicked by a mule but 100 times worse. The first burst caught me across the chest and right shoulder, spinning me around. I remember feeling surprised more than anything. No pain yet, just shock and the bizarre sensation of my body not responding to my commands. I tried to call out to my men, but no sound came. I was falling, the world tilting crazily around me. The second burst hit me as I fell, lower, tearing through my abdomen and hip. That's when the pain came. White hot, all-consuming, like nothing I'd ever felt or have felt since. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving what little air remained from my lungs. I lay there in the bloody snow, trying to understand what had happened, trying to hold on to consciousness as it slipped away from me. Above, the sky was surprisingly blue where it showed through the smoke of battle. Beautiful even. Strange. The things you notice when you're dying. I could hear shouting. My men, I thought, maybe calling for a corpsman. But they sounded far away, fading. Everything was fading. The cold was still there, but different now. Not so much painful as peaceful. Like slipping into a cool bath after a long, hot day. My last conscious thought was of Katie. Her face, her smile. How I'd promised to come home to her. How I was breaking that promise. I felt a tear freeze on my cheek as darkness closed in. Then nothing. Nothing. Until there was something again. The first thing I became aware of was that the pain was gone. Just gone. Like it had never existed. The second thing was that I could see myself lying in the snow, surrounded by chaos, blood pooling beneath me, turning the white ground crimson. I wasn't in my body anymore. I was somewhere else. Above it, around it, I couldn't tell exactly. But I could see everything with perfect clarity. My broken body, Rodriguez kneeling beside me, shouting something I couldn't hear. Chinese troops still advancing, despite the artillery. Lieutenant Walsh directing men toward the secondary position. The mountains looming all around us, indifferent to the human drama playing out on their slopes. I felt no panic, no fear. Just a profound sense of peace and curiosity, I suppose. Like I was watching a film of events that concerned someone else, not me. The detachment was complete. I knew that was my body down there, bleeding out in the Korean snow, but it didn't seem important anymore. What happened next is harder to describe. The scene below me, the battle, my men, my broken body, began to recede as if I was floating upward and away from it all. Colors became more vibrant, sounds faded entirely, and a warmth I can only describe as love surrounded me. Not romantic love, not exactly familial love, but something more encompassing, more fundamental. Like what we call love is just a shadow of this feeling. I became aware that I wasn't alone. There were presences around me. I couldn't see them clearly, not with eyes anyway, but I knew they were there. Some felt familiar, though I couldn't have named them. Others were strange but not frightening. All radiated that same sense of warmth and welcome. A tunnel or corridor seemed to form before me, not made of anything physical, more like a pathway of light that stretched toward something wonderful. I knew with unshakable certainty that if I moved along that path, I would understand everything, know everything, be part of everything. The pull was gentle but persistent. I began to move toward it, drawn by curiosity and that sense of profound welcome. As I did, I became aware of flashes of memory, not just from my life, but what seemed like many lives, all somehow connected to me. I saw myself as a child in Ohio, fishing with my father. I saw moments from basic training, from high school, from early childhood. But I also saw, other times, other places, other selves. A soldier in what might have been the Civil War, a settler moving west in a covered wagon, a sailor on what looked like an ancient ship. Were these past lives? Alternative paths my soul could have taken? Metaphors for aspects of myself? I don't know, even now. But they felt as real as my memories of Korea, of Katie, of my life in Ohio. As I moved closer to that brilliant light at the end of the tunnel, the presences around me seemed to coalesce into more recognizable forms. Not physical bodies, but patterns of light and energy that somehow conveyed identity. And I recognized some of them. Thompson was there, the same Thompson I'd seen die hours earlier from that Chinese grenade. But he wasn't injured or afraid. He radiated joy and that same universal love I felt all around me. Kowalski, too, whole and perfect. And others. My grandfather, who died when I was 14, a childhood friend who drowned when we were 10, faces I knew from somewhere but couldn't place in my earthly memory. They communicated with me, though not in words exactly. It was more direct than that. Pure exchange of meaning and emotion. They were welcoming me, reassuring me, letting me know that everything was as it should be. The light grew brighter as I moved toward it, but it didn't hurt my eyes, or whatever I was perceiving with, since I had no physical body now. It was alluring, promising understanding and peace beyond anything I'd known. I wanted to merge with it, to know its secrets. But as I approached, something made me pause. A thought, a memory, a connection. Katie, my parents, my buddies still fighting on that frozen hillside. Something pulled at me, held me back from complete surrender to that light. And then I was in the presence of something I can only describe as divine. Not a bearded man on a throne, nothing so limited or human. A consciousness vast and loving that knew me completely and loved me completely. I felt like a child who had been lost and finally found their way home. The presence communicated with me, though again, not in words exactly. Images, feelings, direct understanding flowed into me. I was shown the pattern of my life, how every moment, joyful or painful, had shaped me, taught me, prepared me. Nothing had been wasted or meaningless, though from my limited human perspective, it had often seemed so. I was shown the lives I'd touched. Some I knew about, many I didn't. Small kindnesses I'd forgotten had altered the course of other lives. Even my failures had sometimes led to growth, for myself or others. Everything interconnected in ways impossible to see from within the confines of physical existence. Most powerfully, I was made to understand that this wasn't the end. That what we call death is just a transition, a change of state, not a ceasing to be. That the essence of who I am continued, had always existed, would always exist, though in forms I couldn't fully comprehend from my human perspective. I wanted to stay there forever, basking in that perfect understanding and love. But as that thought formed, I sensed, not reluctance exactly, but a kind of gentle correction from the presence. I wasn't meant to stay. Not yet. Images flooded into me then. Katie holding a baby I somehow knew was ours, though we had no children yet. My mother's face, aged beyond her current years. My buddies from Fox Company, older, at what seemed to be a reunion. A classroom where I stood at the front, teaching young men and women who listened intently. Future possibilities. Paths I could still walk if I returned. Lives I could still touch. Lessons I could still learn and teach. But I want to stay. I protested, though not in words. The response came with gentle humor and profound love. Your time will come again, but not yet. You have more to do, more to become. And with that, I felt myself being drawn back, away from the light, back through the tunnel, past the presences that had welcomed me. Some part of me resisted. The peace and love I'd experienced were so perfect, so complete, that returning to the limitations and pain of physical existence seemed almost cruel. But another part understood, accepted. Even as I was pulled back, I was given a gift, a message to carry with me. Not words exactly, but a truth so profound it changed everything about how I understood life, death, purpose, connection. A truth I've spent the rest of my life trying to fully comprehend and live by. The transition back was jarring. One moment I was surrounded by light and love. The next I was slammed back into a broken body, into pain so intense it defied description, into cold that bit through to my bones. I gasped, choking on blood, my lungs burning as they fought to draw air. The sky above was no longer peaceful or distant. It was immediate, pressing down, filled with the smoke and noise of battle. The detachment was gone. I was fully, painfully present in my shattered body. He's alive! Corpman! Corpman! Rodriguez's voice cracking with emotion and disbelief. His face appeared above me, streaked with dirt and blood, eyes wide with shock. Hang on, Sarge. Just hang on. I tried to speak, to tell him what I'd seen, what I knew now, but only blood came from my lips. The pain was overwhelming, threatening to drag me back into unconsciousness. But something in me fought to stay present, to hold on to both the memory of what I'd experienced and the tenuous threat of my physical life. Hands were on me then. The battalion corpsman, I realized dimly. He was shouting orders, applying pressure to wounds, injecting something into my arm. Morphine, probably. The blessed numbness began to spread, dulling the worst of the pain. Multiple GSWs, chest, abdomen, hip. He's lost a lot of blood. Need immediate evac. The corpsman's clinical assessment barely penetrated my awareness. I was lifted onto a poncho that served as a makeshift stretcher. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through me despite the morphine, and darkness crept in at the edges of my vision. I fought it, focusing on Rodriguez's face as he helped carry me. Stay with us, Sarge, he kept saying over and over. Just stay with us. I wanted to tell him I wasn't afraid anymore. That I knew now what waited beyond this life. That it was beautiful beyond imagining. But I couldn't form the words, couldn't make my broken body obey. The journey to the aid station is mostly a blur in my memory. Flashes of sky, of faces looking down at me, of pain that came and went in waves. The distant thunder of artillery and small arms fire. The jostling of the makeshift stretcher as my men carried me over rough terrain, trying their best not to cause more damage. At some point, a helicopter appeared, one of the early medical evacuation choppers they were just starting to use in Korea. I remember the deafening roar of the rotors, the vibration as they loaded me aboard. A medic leaning close to check my vitals, shaking his head in what looked like disbelief that I was still alive. Then darkness took me again. I woke 3 days later in a MASH unit near Hungnam. Surgeons had worked for hours to repair what the Chinese machine gun had torn apart. 4 bullets had hit me, 2 in the chest, 1 through my liver, 1 that shattered my right hip. By all medical logic, I should have died on that hillside. The doctor who finally spoke to me when I was conscious enough to understand said as much. "You're either the luckiest man I've ever treated, or someone up there likes you a whole lot," he said, checking my bandages. "Your heart stopped twice on the operating table. We were about ready to call it when you came back on your own." I tried to tell him then about what I'd experienced, about the light, the presence, the profound understanding I'd been given. But the words were inadequate, like trying to describe an ocean to someone who's only seen puddles. And I was weak, my voice barely a whisper, my thoughts scattered by pain and medication. "Take it easy, Sergeant," he said, patting my shoulder gently. "You've got a long recovery ahead. Plenty of time for stories later." He was right about the recovery. I spent 2 months in that MASH unit before I was stable enough to be transferred to a proper hospital in Japan. Another 3 months there, undergoing surgeries to repair my shattered hip, to address complications from the damage to my liver and lungs. By the time they finally put me on a transport ship back to the States, spring was turning to summer, and the war in Korea continued without me. The physical healing was only part of it, though. The harder part was integrating what had happened to me. Not just the trauma of being wounded, of nearly dying, but the experience beyond death that had transformed my understanding of everything, really. How do you return to normal life after touching the divine? How do you explain to others what you've seen when language itself seems hopelessly inadequate to the task? On the long voyage home across the Pacific, I had time to think, to try to make sense of it all. I wrote pages and pages in a journal, attempting to capture the experience before it faded, trying different words and metaphors to describe something that existed beyond words. Some nights I would stand at the ship's rail, looking at the stars reflected in the dark water, and feel echoes of that profound connection I'd experienced. Other wounded men on the ship noticed my preoccupation, my quietness. Most assumed it was the normal 1,000-yard stare that many combat veterans develop. A few, though, those who had come close to death themselves, seemed to sense something different in me. One night, a corporal named Daniels, who'd lost both legs to a landmine, sat beside me on deck. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked quietly, lighting a cigarette. "When you were, when you died." I looked at him, surprised. "How did you know?" He smiled faintly, blowing smoke into the sea breeze. "Recognized it in your eyes. Same look my buddy Martinez had after he flatlined for 6 minutes from a chest wound. Same look I probably had for a while." "You too?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Not as long as you, I don't think. Just flashes. Light. Sorry, peace. Knowing everything was going to be all right somehow." We talked until dawn, sharing experiences that we'd been afraid to voice to others for fear of being thought crazy or worse. His experience had been briefer than mine, less detailed, but with the same fundamental quality of love and understanding. It was the first time since returning that I felt truly understood, that I could speak openly about what had happened to me beyond the physical facts of my wounding. "What do you think it means?" he asked as the sun began to rise over the Pacific, turning the water to molten gold. "Why do some of us come back? Why are we shown these things?" I thought about the message I'd been given, the truth I was still struggling to fully comprehend. I think we're supposed to remember," I said slowly, "to carry something back, each in our own way." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Yeah, that feels right." We fell silent then, watching the sunrise together. 2 broken men who had glimpsed something beyond the brokenness, beyond the pain and limitations of physical existence. In that moment, I felt a sense of purpose forming. Not clear yet, not fully developed, but the beginning of understanding why I had been sent back. The ship docked in San Francisco in July 1951. I was transferred to a veterans hospital in California for more rehabilitation. My parents flew out from Ohio to see me, their faces a mixture of joy that I was alive and shock at my condition. I was still underweight, pale, using crutches to move around, with a metal brace supporting my reconstructed hip. "Oh, Jimmy," my mother said, tears streaming down her face as she held me carefully, afraid of hurting me. "My boy, my beautiful boy." My father, never an emotional man, simply gripped my shoulder and said, "Proud of you, son." But I could see in his eyes what it cost him to see me so changed from the healthy young man who had shipped out to Korea. Katie came 2 weeks later. We'd been writing, of course, long letters while I was in the hospital in Japan, where I'd tried to prepare her for how different I was, physically at least. But seeing the reality was still a shock for her. I saw it in the momentary widening of her eyes, the slight hesitation before she crossed the hospital room to embrace me. Yuri, you're here, she whispered against my neck. That's all that matters. You came back to me. I held her as tightly as my healing body would allow, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her tears against my skin. I promised I would, I said. What I didn't say then, couldn't say, was that I had almost chosen not to return. That the pull of that light, that perfect understanding and love, had almost been stronger than my connection to her, to this world. How could I explain that without hurting her? How could anyone who hadn't experienced it understand such a thing? So I kept it simple. Told her about my wounds, my recovery progress, the likelihood that I would always walk with a limp, that there would be limitations to what I could do physically. Prepared her for the practical realities of loving a man whose body had been broken by war. None of that matters to me, she said fiercely. We'll figure it out together. I'm just thankful you're alive. Alive. Yes, I was that. But I was also fundamentally changed in ways that had nothing to do with my physical injuries. Ways I was only beginning to understand myself, let alone explain to others. The doctors called it a miracle that I had survived. The medals they pinned on me later, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, seemed almost absurd in their inadequacy to capture what had really happened on that frozen hillside in Korea. The official report noted that I had been critically wounded while covering the withdrawal of his squad, and continued to direct his men even after sustaining life-threatening injuries. The truth was both simpler and infinitely more complex. I had died. I had seen beyond the veil that separates this life from whatever comes next. And I had returned, carrying a message I was still struggling to fully understand, let alone convey to others. As my body slowly healed over the following months, I began the harder work of integrating my experience, of finding ways to live authentically in light of what I now knew. The military doctors eventually determined that I was unfit for further service, no surprise given the extent of my injuries, and I received an honorable discharge in December 1951, just over a year after I'd been hit. Katie and I were married in the spring of 1952, a small ceremony in her parents' backyard in Columbus. I managed to walk down the aisle with only a cane for support, a victory that represented months of painful physical therapy and determination. My buddies who had survived Korea, Rodriguez, Harrison, Miller, Jackson, all came. O'Neill, too, in a wheelchair, his leg eventually amputated after complications from his wound. Lieutenant Walsh, now Captain Walsh, made it as well, still carrying the weight of command in the set of his shoulders. We didn't talk much about that day on the ridge. Some experiences are too painful, too personal to revisit in casual conversation. But in quiet moments, one-on-one, some of them asked me about what had happened after I was hit. Rodriguez said you were gone, Sarge. Miller told me the night before the wedding, both of us sitting on the porch of my parents' house nursing beers. No pulse, no breathing, for at least 5 minutes before the corpsman got to you. He swears you were dead. I looked at him, trying to gauge whether he was ready for the truth. I was, I said simply. His eyes widened slightly. And I saw things, Miller. Things that changed everything for me. I told him then, as much as I could put into words, about floating above my body, about the tunnel of light, about the presence I'd encountered and the understanding I'd been given. He listened without interruption, without the skepticism I'd feared. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkened street, the peaceful Ohio neighborhood so far removed from the frozen hell where we'd fought together. You know, he finally said, my grandfather used to talk about something similar. He was gassed in the Great War, was clinically dead for several minutes before they revived him. He never talked about it much, said words couldn't do it justice. But he was different after, my dad always said. More peaceful, like he knew something others didn't. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It's hard to be afraid of death when you've seen what waits on the other side, I said. But it's also hard to explain that to people without sounding crazy. Miller raised his beer in a small toast. I don't think you're crazy, Sarge. I think you're the sanest man I know. Conversations like that helped. Finding others who, if they hadn't experienced what I had, could at least approach it with an open mind, who could help me process what had happened and what it meant for my life going forward. Katie tried to understand too, listening patiently as I attempted to explain what I'd seen, what I'd learned. But there was always a distance there, a gap between my experience and her comprehension that neither of us could fully bridge. "I believe that you believe it," she said once, holding my hand across our kitchen table. "And that's enough for me. I don't need to understand it completely to know that it changed you, that it matters to you." Her acceptance, even without full understanding, was a gift. So many others who have had experiences like mine face ridicule, dismissal, or worse. Being able to speak openly about it, even if only with those closest to me, helped me begin to integrate what had happened, to find meaning in it. The message I'd been given, that wordless truth that had been imparted to me in that space beyond life, began to clarify as time passed. It wasn't a specific instruction or prophecy, nothing as simple as do this or go there. It was more fundamental, more universal. Everything is connected. Everything has purpose. Love is the basis of all reality. Death is not an ending. Simple truths, perhaps. The kind that religions have taught in various forms for millennia. But there's a difference between believing something as a matter of faith and knowing it as directly experienced reality. I didn't believe these things anymore. I knew them as surely as I knew my own name, my own face in the mirror. The question became, how do I live in light of this knowledge? How do I fulfill whatever purpose sent me back? I went back to school on the GI Bill, finished my degree in education, became a history teacher at the local high school. Katie and I bought a small house, started a family, a son in 1954, a daughter in 1956, just as I had seen in the vision I was shown before returning. From the outside, it probably looked like a normal life, a typical post-war American success story. Wounded veteran comes home, overcomes his injuries, builds a good life with his sweetheart, raises a family, becomes a productive member of society. The kind of story people like to tell in the Eisenhower years. The kind that reinforced our collective narrative about what America was and could be. But beneath that conventional surface, I was constantly working to align my outer life with the deeper truths I had encountered. Teaching became more than a job. It became a calling, a way to shape young minds, to quietly introduce ideas about interconnection, about meaning beyond the material, about the deeper patterns of history and human experience. I began speaking to small groups about near-death experiences, first at local churches, then at hospitals and universities as interest in the phenomenon grew. This was long before NDEs were widely discussed or studied. The term hadn't even been coined yet, so I often faced skepticism or outright dismissal. But I also found others who had similar stories, who had touched that same reality beyond our physical existence. A community began to form. Informal at first, just people getting together to share experiences that mainstream society wasn't ready to acknowledge or understand. Veterans, accident survivors, people who had clinically died during surgeries or heart attacks, all carrying pieces of the same puzzle, all trying to integrate profound spiritual experiences into ordinary lives. Not all of them had encountered exactly what I had. The details varied. Some spoke of meeting religious figures, others of deceased relatives, some of reviewing their entire lives. But the core elements remained consistent: the sense of peace, the overwhelming love, the understanding that death was not an end, that everything was somehow perfectly as it should be despite appearances to the contrary. Together we began to see patterns, to recognize that these experiences weren't random hallucinations of dying brains, as skeptics claimed, but glimpses of something real and universal that transcended cultural or religious backgrounds. Something that had the power to fundamentally transform those who experienced it. My hip never fully healed. The pain became a constant companion, worse in cold weather or when storms approached. The doctors offered pain medication, but I mostly declined. The pain kept me grounded in a way, a reminder of the physical reality I had chosen to return to, with all its limitations and challenges. It also connected me to my experience in a strange way. On the worst days when the pain made it hard to walk, hard to think, I would close my eyes and remember the perfect peace I had felt, the absence of all suffering in that state beyond the body. Not with longing or regret, but as a reminder that this physical existence, with all its beauty and pain, was temporary. A classroom, not a prison sentence. As the years passed, I watched my children grow, taught generations of students, saw the world change around me. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, civil rights protests, the moon landing, Watergate, the fall of Saigon. Through it all, the knowledge I had gained during those moments beyond remained my compass, my foundation. I stayed in touch with my buddies from Fox Company. Rodriguez became a lawyer, advocating for veterans' rights. Harrison went back to Kentucky, took over his family's farm, raised 5 kids. Miller worked for the telephone company, never married. O'Neill, despite losing his leg, became a Paralympic swimmer. Won medals for the U.S. in the 1960s. We met every few years, usually in Washington, D.C., to remember those who hadn't made it back, to reconnect with the brotherhood that had been forged in that frozen hell. During one of those reunions in the late 1970s, Rodriguez pulled me aside after dinner, both of us a little drunk on whiskey and nostalgia. "I never told you this, Sarge," he said, his voice low and tense. "But I saw something that day when you got hit." I looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "When you were lying there, when I thought you were dead, I saw something leave you. Like I don't know, a shimmering, above your body, for just a second or two. I thought I was losing my mind, you know. Battle fatigue or something. Never told anyone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned hotel room." "Why are you telling me now?" He took another sip of his drink, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Because I read an article about near-death experiences, about people floating above their bodies, seeing things from above. Made me think maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe I really saw you, the real you, leaving your body for a while." I put a hand on his shoulder, feeling a profound connection to this man who had been with me at my moment of death and return. "You weren't crazy, Rodriguez, and neither was I." He nodded, relief evident in his eyes. "I figured as much. You've been different since that day, you know. Not in a bad way, just different. Like you know something the rest of us don't." "Not something I know," I corrected gently. "Something I remember. Something we all know deep down, but forget when we're here, in these bodies, in this life." He smiled, raised his glass. "To remembering, then." "To remembering," I echoed. That conversation with Rodriguez was a validation I hadn't realized I needed. To have external confirmation of what I had experienced, someone who had actually seen something leaving my body, helped quiet the small, rational voice that sometimes still whispered that perhaps it had all been a hallucination, a dream created by a dying brain starved of oxygen. The older I got, the more open I became about my experience. The world was changing too. By the 1980s, books about NDEs were bestsellers. Researchers like Raymond Moody and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross were doing serious work on the phenomenon, and the medical establishment was beginning to take these accounts more seriously. I retired from teaching in 1988, but found myself busier than ever. I spoke at conferences, participated in research studies at universities, counseled people who had their own NDEs and were struggling to integrate them. Katie supported all of this, even when it meant time away from home, even when friends or family raised eyebrows at my increasingly public role as an NDE experiencer, as we were starting to be called. "This is why you came back," she said once, helping me pack for a symposium in New York. "To help others understand, to be a bridge." She was right, of course. That was the purpose I had gradually discovered over the decades. To be a witness, to help translate that beyond-death understanding into terms that could help people in this life. Not proselytizing, not claiming special knowledge or status, but simply sharing what I had experienced and what it had taught me about being human. My physical health declined as I entered my 70s. The damage from those machine gun rounds so many years ago had long-term consequences. Reduced lung capacity, liver problems, arthritis in my reconstructed hip that eventually required a replacement. But I pushed on, feeling that my time was limited, that there was still work to be done. Katie died in 1997. Peacefully in her sleep after a short battle with cancer. I was devastated, of course. We had been together for nearly 50 years, had built a life, raised children, grown old together. But beneath the grief was a strange comfort. I knew she wasn't gone, not really. Different, transformed, beyond my physical reach for now, but not gone. At her funeral, our children worried about me, about how I would cope alone. They didn't understand that I wasn't afraid of joining her, that what others feared, death, extinction, the unknown, held no terror for me. What I feared was leaving my work unfinished, leaving things unsaid that needed to be heard. So I continued, despite increasing frailty, despite the concerned looks from my son and daughter when I pushed myself too hard. I wrote a book about my experience. Not the first account of an NDE by any means, but perhaps one of the longest delayed, coming nearly 50 years after the event itself. It found an audience, not a bestseller, but steadily read. passed between people searching for answers about life's biggest questions. My message remained consistent through all these years, all these venues. We are more than our bodies. Death is not an ending. Love is the foundation of reality. Everything is connected in ways we can barely comprehend from within our limited human perspective. Simple truths, yet revolutionary when fully embraced. Truths that have the power to transform how we live, how we treat each other, how we face our own mortality. I'm an old man now. The young sergeant who bled out in the Korean snow more than 70 years ago seems like another person sometimes, viewed across the vast expanse of a life fully lived. My hair is white, my hands shake slightly. My rebuilt hip creaks and complains when I move. The doctors say my heart is weakening, that my time is limited. I'm not afraid. How could I be, having seen what waits beyond? If anything, there's a quiet anticipation building in me, like a traveler who has been away from home for a very long time and knows he will soon return. Not that I'm in a hurry. There's still joy in this life, still moments of beauty and connection worth experiencing. My grandchildren, the changing seasons, the simple pleasure of sunlight on my face. But I know what's coming is not an end. It's a continuation, a return, a remembering of what we truly are beneath the mask we wear in this physical existence. I've been given a glimpse behind the curtain, and nothing has ever been the same since. That's my message. That's why I came back from that frozen hillside in Korea. Why I fought through decades of pain and limitation. Why I've told this story again and again, despite skepticism, despite the inadequacy of words to capture the experience. Not to convince you to believe what I believe, not to claim special knowledge or status, but to offer a possibility that what we see and touch and measure is not all there is. That consciousness, identity, love, these things transcend the physical. That death is not the end of the story, but simply the turning of a page. I died in Korea by machine gun fire. Hovering above the chaos transformed my whole life. And the message I brought back is both simpler and more profound than I ever could have imagined. We are eternal. We are loved. We are never alone. And everything has meaning, even if we can't see it from where we stand. Remember that. That's why I came back to tell you. You might wonder if the memory fades over time, if what I experienced beyond death has become less vivid as the decades have passed. It hasn't. Not a single detail has dimmed. That's one of the ways I know it wasn't a dream or hallucination. Dreams fade. Even our most important memories get fuzzy around the edges as we age. But this remains crystal clear. More real sometimes than what I experienced yesterday. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let me go back to the beginning of my return. Not just to life, but to a normal existence after the hospitals, after the medical discharges, after coming home. The first year was the hardest. Not just physically, though God knows that was challenging enough. Learning to walk again with a shattered hip, building back strength after losing nearly 40 pounds of muscle, managing pain that medications could only dull, never eliminate. But the physical challenges were straightforward in a way. Follow the doctor's advice. Do the exercises. Push a little further each day. The body has its own wisdom, its own path to healing when given the chance. The mental and spiritual adjustments were far more complex. How do you go grocery shopping when you've seen the face of God? How do you make small talk at a neighborhood barbecue when you've experienced the profound interconnectedness of all souls? How do you worry about mortgage payments or car repairs when you've been shown the ephemeral nature of all material concerns? I struggled with this disconnect for months after coming home. Katie noticed, of course. She'd find me staring out the window for hours or sitting in our backyard at night looking up at the stars with tears streaming down my face. Where do you go? She asked me once, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders as I sat on our back steps well past midnight. When you get that look in your eyes, where are you? I turned to her, seeing the worry in her face, the fear that some part of me had never really come back from Korea. I'm trying to hold on to it, I said. The understanding I had when I was gone. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grip, the more slips through your fingers. She sat beside me, her shoulder pressed against mine in the cool Ohio night. Maybe you're not supposed to hold on to it that way, she suggested gently. Maybe it's not something you grasp, but something you live. Her words hit me with the force of revelation. She was right. I'd been treating my experience like an artifact to be preserved, studied, kept pristine in memory. But that wasn't why I'd been sent back. The message wasn't meant to be locked away like a sacred text, but to be lived, embodied, shared through action rather than just words. That conversation marked a turning point for me. I stopped trying to recapture the indescribable perfection of what I'd experienced beyond death and started looking for ways to translate it into my daily life. Not perfectly, no human life can perfectly reflect divine truths, but authentically, consistently, in ways big and small. It began with my relationship with Katie. The love I'd experienced in that place beyond was unconditional, all-encompassing. Could I bring even a fraction of that quality into my marriage? Could I love her not just for how she made me feel or what she did for me, but simply for who she was in her essence? I tried. Some days I failed miserably, but the intention transformed our relationship in subtle, powerful ways. I became more present with her, more attuned to her needs and dreams, less caught up in my own concerns. She noticed the change. "You look at me differently now," she said one evening as we washed dishes together. A domestic scene so ordinary yet suddenly infused with deeper meaning. "How so?" I asked, curious about what she was perceiving. She thought for a moment, hands suspended in soapy water. "Like you're really seeing me. Not just my face or what I'm doing, but me." I kissed her then, my hands still dripping water onto the linoleum floor. Because she was right. I was seeing her differently. Not just her physical form or her role as my wife, but the luminous consciousness that inhabited that form, the eternal soul that I had glimpsed in that place beyond death. I was seeing the part of her that would never die, that had perhaps existed for eons before taking this particular form called Katie. "I love you," I said, the familiar words carrying new depths of meaning. "All of you, the you beyond all this." She didn't fully understand what I meant. How could she, without having experienced what I had? But she felt the truth in it, the depth of recognition and acceptance. That was enough. My approach to parenthood changed too after our children were born. John came first in 1954, a sturdy boy with Katie's dark hair and my stubborn chin. Mary followed 2 years later, delicate and watchful from her first moments. Looking into their newborn eyes, I saw not just our genetic continuation, but new manifestations of eternal consciousness, souls that had chosen to journey into physical existence through us. I felt a profound responsibility not just to raise them to be good citizens or successful adults by the standards of 1950s America, but to create an environment where their spiritual awareness could flourish alongside their physical and intellectual development. Not through rigid religious instruction, though we did attend church, but through fostering wonder, compassion, and an openness to the mysteries beyond material existence. "Daddy, what happens when we die?" John asked me once when he was about 6, after a neighborhood dog had been hit by a car. Such a fundamental question, one that most parents answer with comforting platitudes or simplified religious concepts. I took him onto my lap, choosing my words carefully. "I believe that the part of us that makes us who we are, not our bodies, but our thoughts and feelings and the essence of our being, that part continues. It returns to a greater reality that's more wonderful than we can imagine while we're here." He considered this with the seriousness that children bring to existential questions. "Have you been there?" For a moment, I was startled by his intuition. Then I nodded slowly. "For a brief time, yes. When I was hurt in the war." "What was it like?" he asked, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. "Like coming home after being away for a very long time?" I told him. "Like being surrounded by more love than you can imagine. Like understanding everything all at once." He nodded, satisfied with this answer, in a way that only children can be. "That sounds nice," he said simply, then asked if he could go play with his trucks. These conversations happened naturally throughout their childhoods, moments where the veil between ordinary reality and deeper truths seemed to thin, where questions arose that demanded more than conventional answers. I never forced my understanding on them, never claimed absolute knowledge or authority. I simply shared my experience and the insights it had given me, then allowed them the freedom to form their own relationship with these mysteries. My work as a teacher became another venue for living out the understanding I'd gained. I taught history at Lincoln High School for over 30 years, from 1953 until my retirement in 1988. On the surface, I covered the standard curriculum: ancient civilizations, European history, American government, the unfolding drama of the 20th century that I'd played my small part in. But beneath that conventional structure, I tried to convey a deeper perspective, that history isn't just a sequence of events, leaders, wars, and technological developments, but the story of consciousness evolving through time, of humanity gradually, and sometimes painfully, learning lessons that bring us closer to understanding our true nature and potential. Mr. Conley, a student named Michael asked during a lesson on World War II, how can we make sense of something like the Holocaust? How could God allow that to happen? The classroom fell silent. It was 1967, and discussions about the Holocaust were still relatively new in American high schools. Many teachers would have deflected the question, steered the conversation back to safer territory. But I recognized it as one of those moments where something more than academic knowledge was being sought. These young people, coming of age during Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement, were grappling with fundamental questions about meaning, justice, and the nature of reality. That's the central question of history, isn't it? I replied after a thoughtful pause. How do we reconcile the existence of profound evil and suffering with the belief in a benevolent order to the universe? I moved to sit on the edge of my desk, leg aching from standing too long. I can't give you a simple answer that will make the horror of the Holocaust make sense. I don't think such an answer exists, at least not one our minds can fully grasp while we're here. The students watched me intently, sensing perhaps that this wasn't just academic philosophy, but something I'd wrestled with personally. What I can tell you is this. I believe that our time here, in these bodies, in this physical reality with all its beauty and ugliness, is just one chapter in a much longer story. That the suffering we experience and witness here is real and matters deeply, but it's not the totality of existence. That somehow, and I don't claim to understand exactly how, every soul's journey continues beyond what we can see and measure. Michael frowned, not entirely satisfied. So we should just accept evil because eventually everyone goes to heaven or gets reincarnated or whatever? No, I said firmly. Absolutely not. Understanding that physical death isn't the end doesn't mean we shouldn't fight against suffering and injustice with everything we have. In fact, I think it makes that fight more important, not less. Because if we're all connected, if we're all expressions of the same underlying consciousness experiencing itself in different forms, then what we do to others, good or evil, we ultimately do to ourselves. I'm not sure how many of them truly understood what I was trying to convey. But for some, I could see a spark of recognition, a momentary glimpse of a perspective beyond the conventional frameworks they'd been given. That was enough. Seeds planted that might germinate later when they were ready. Not all my colleagues appreciated my approach. The principal called me into his office once after a parent complained that I was teaching Eastern mysticism instead of historical facts. Jim, he said, leaning back in his chair, you know I respect you as a teacher. The kids love you. Your test scores are excellent. But I'm getting concerns about some of the philosophical tangents in your classroom. I nodded, understanding his position. Jack, I teach every fact in the curriculum. I prepare my students thoroughly for their exams. But facts without context, without meaning, are just mental clutter that they'll forget as soon as the test is over. I understand that, he said carefully. But there's a line between providing context and promoting personal spiritual beliefs. Some parents feel you're crossing it. I considered how to respond. Jack was a reasonable man, a good administrator trying to balance multiple concerns. And I had no desire to create problems for the school or for myself. I'll be more mindful, I promised. But I hope you understand that I can't teach history as if it's just a series of dates and names, not after what I've experienced, what I've seen. He studied me for a moment, perhaps remembering that I was more than just another teacher, that I carried the visible and invisible scars of combat, that I had nearly died serving our country. Just keep it within reasonable bounds, he finally said, and maybe save the deeper philosophical discussions for after the required material is covered. I agreed and found ways to adapt my approach, being more careful with explicit spiritual language while still conveying the underlying perspective that informed my understanding of history and human experience. It was a balancing act, but one worth maintaining. Outside the classroom, I began to connect with others who had experiences similar to mine. This wasn't easy in the 1950s and 60s. The term near-death experience hadn't been coined yet. There were no support groups, no books or television programs exploring the phenomenon. Those who had glimpsed beyond the veil often kept it to themselves, fearing ridicule or worse. But gradually, tentatively, we found each other. A nurse at the VA hospital where I still went for physical therapy confided that she'd had an out-of-body experience during childbirth. A fellow teacher who'd survived a lightning strike described floating above his body, moving through a tunnel toward an incredible light. A neighbor who'd nearly drowned as a child told me about meeting deceased relatives in a garden of unearthly beauty. We began meeting informally, First, just 3 or 4 of us in living rooms or quiet corners of restaurants. Later, growing to a dozen or more as word spread through whispered recommendations. Talk to Jim Conley. He understands. He's been there too. These gatherings were part support group, part philosophical discussion, part spiritual communion. We shared our experiences without fear of judgment, compared notes on how the afterward had changed us, helped each other navigate the challenge of integrating profound spiritual insights into ordinary lives. The hardest part, said Eleanor the nurse during one of our early meetings, is not being able to hold on to that perfect peace. I feel like I had it in my hands for a brief, beautiful moment, and now I'm spending the rest of my life trying to remember exactly what it felt like. Heads nodded around the room. We all knew that feeling, the poignant sense of exile from a perfect state we had briefly touched. I don't think we're meant to fully recapture it while we're here, I suggested. Maybe that's part of the design of physical existence, that we glimpse the larger reality just enough to know it's there, but not so completely that we become detached from this life and its purposes. What purposes? Asked Frank, the lightning strike survivor, a hint of bitterness in his voice. If what we experience is real, if that's our true home, then what's the point of all this struggle and limitation? It was a question I'd wrestled with myself. Why return? Why continue in a damaged body, in a world full of suffering and confusion, when I'd experienced the perfect peace and understanding of that place beyond? I began slowly, trying to articulate something I felt more than understood intellectually. I think this physical existence is a kind of school, a place where souls learn and grow through experiences that aren't possible in that state of perfect unity and understanding, where we develop through challenge and choice and consequence in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So we're here to learn lessons? Eleanor asked. That sounds like something from a greeting card. I smiled at her bluntness. Not just learn in the intellectual sense. Become, transform. Physical existence with all its messiness and pain and joy is alchemical. It changes us in fundamental ways. The conversations in those early gathering groups helped me articulate and refine my understanding of what I'd experienced. They also showed me that while the details of near-death experiences varied widely, influenced by cultural background, religious upbringing, individual psychology, the core elements remained remarkably consistent. The sense of peace, moving through darkness toward light, encountering a presence of unconditional love, gaining profound insights about the nature of reality, returning with a transformed perspective on life and death. This consistency across cultures, across religions, across time, suggested to me that we were all glimpsing the same underlying reality, though we might interpret it through different conceptual frameworks. As the decades passed, scientific and cultural attitudes toward near-death experiences began to shift. Raymond Moody published Life After Life in 1975, introducing the term near-death experience and bringing these accounts to mainstream attention. The International Association for Near-Death Studies was founded in 1978, beginning serious academic research into the phenomenon. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, already famous for her work on death and dying, began speaking openly about the evidence for consciousness surviving physical death. Suddenly, experiences like mine were being discussed on television, in magazines, and university lecture halls. The veil of silence was lifting. What had once been shared in whispers was now the subject of best-selling books and documentary films. This cultural shift brought both validation and new challenges. On one hand, it was profoundly affirming to see experiences like mine taken seriously, studied with scientific rigor, recognized as meaningful rather than dismissed as hallucination or delusion. On the other hand, as NDE accounts became more popular, they also became more commodified, sometimes stripped of their depth and complexity to fit neatly into New Age spirituality or religious apologetics. I was invited to participate in research studies at several universities during the 1980s and 90s. I sat for interviews with psychologists, neuroscientists, religious scholars. I took part in panel discussions alongside other NDE experiencers, comparing our accounts, looking for patterns and variations. Some researchers approached the phenomenon with genuine openness. Others seemed determined to reduce it to brain chemistry or cultural conditioning. One neurologist at Ohio State was particularly dismissive. "What you experienced, Mr. Conley," he said during our interview session, "can be fully explained by anoxia, oxygen deprivation to the brain, combined with the release of endorphins and other neurochemicals triggered by extreme trauma. The tunnel, the light, the sense of peace, all normal neurological responses to your brain shutting down. I regarded him thoughtfully. He was young, brilliant in his field, no doubt, confident in the materialist paradigm that dominated his education and profession. That may be, I conceded. I don't claim to understand the neurological mechanisms involved. But tell me, doctor, how does your explanation account for the verifiable information I brought back? He frowned. What? What information? I saw events happening at a distance from my body. I explained. I observed my squad mates dragging me back toward the aid station. I heard conversations that occurred while I had no heartbeat, no brain activity. Later, Rodriguez and others confirmed these details. Details I couldn't have known if my experience was merely a dying brain producing hallucinations. The neurologist shifted uncomfortably. Coincidence, perhaps? Or you heard things subconsciously before losing consciousness completely, and your brain incorporated them into the hallucination. Perhaps. I echoed, not wanting to argue. I'd learned over the years that those firmly committed to a materialist worldview would find any explanation, however tortured, more acceptable than considering that consciousness might exist independent of the brain, even temporarily. Other researchers were more open-minded. A psychology professor named Dr. Elizabeth Chen conducted a long-term study of NDE experiencers, tracking how the experience changed our values, beliefs, and behaviors over time. She interviewed me multiple times across a 5-year period. What I find most compelling, she told me during our final session, isn't just the consistency across different accounts, though that's remarkable, but the consistent pattern of life changes afterward. People who've had NDEs show measurable shifts toward more altruistic behavior, reduced materialism, decreased fear of death, increased appreciation for nature and relationships. Whatever's happening during these experiences, it profoundly transforms those who have them. She leaned forward, her academic detachment momentarily giving way to genuine curiosity. In your case, Mr. Conley, it's been nearly 40 years since your experience. Has its impact diminished over time, or has it remained a central reference point for your life? It's only grown more significant, I told her without hesitation. In the early years, I was still trying to understand it, integrate it, find words for something that exists beyond language. As I've grown older, I've come to recognize its centrality to everything else in my life. It's the foundation that gives meaning to everything that's followed. She nodded, making notes. And the fear of death? Has that changed for you? I smiled. I'm not eager to leave my family, my work, this beautiful world. But afraid? No. How can you fear something when you've seen what waits on the other side? It would be like fearing going home after a long journey. These research projects and public discussions of NDEs brought many people into my life, some seeking guidance about their own experiences, others hoping to understand a loved one's account, still others simply curious about what lies beyond death. I tried to meet each person where they were, to offer what insight I could without claiming certainty beyond what I directly experienced. One interaction stands out in my memory. In the late 1980s, after an interview I'd done with a local newspaper about my NDE had been published, I received a call from a woman named Susan. Her son, a 19-year-old Marine, had been killed in the bombing of the barracks in Beirut in 1983. I read your story, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion, about what you saw when you died in Korea. I need to know, is it real? Is my boy still somewhere? Is he okay? The rawness of her grief, the desperate hope in her question, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't academic research or philosophical discussion. This was a mother's heart seeking comfort for an unbearable loss. Would you like to meet in person? I asked gently. This isn't a conversation I want to have over the phone. We met the next day at a quiet coffee shop. Susan was in her early 50s, her face lined with grief but composed, dignified. She brought a photograph of her son Michael in his dress blues, his young face serious but with a hint of mischief in his eyes. He was so proud to be a Marine, she said, touching the photo with gentle fingers. Like his father and grandfather before him, he would have turned 23 next month. I listened as she told me about her son, his childhood exploits, his love of baseball, his dream of becoming an engineer after his service. I recognized the need to make him real to me, not just an abstract subject for spiritual speculation. After she'd shared these memories, she fixed me with a direct gaze. Now tell me the truth. From your experience, not from what would be comforting to hear, is my son still existing somewhere? Is he aware? Is he suffering? I chose my words carefully, wanting to honor both her question and the limitations of my knowledge. I can only tell you what I experienced and what it showed me about the nature of our existence. I began. Based on that experience, I believe with absolute certainty that we are more than our physical bodies, that consciousness continues after death, and that it continues in a state that's characterized by profound peace, love, and understanding. I paused, making sure she was following me. I didn't see your son specifically, of course, but I encountered others who had died. Comrades from my unit, family members who had passed before. They were fully themselves, their personalities, their memories intact, but also more than they had been in physical form. More complete, more whole. Were they happy? She asked, the simple question containing worlds of maternal concern. They were beyond what we think of as happiness or sadness here. I tried to explain. Those emotions as we experience them are reactions to circumstances, to wants and needs being met or denied. What I sensed from those who had crossed over was a more fundamental state of rightness, of being exactly where they were meant to be, understanding their place in a larger pattern that made perfect sense from that perspective. Tears were flowing down Susan's cheeks now, but her gaze remained steady. Do you think he knows how much I miss him? How much I love him? This question struck at the heart of what I'd experienced about the interconnection of souls, the continuity of love across the boundary of death. One of the clearest insights I brought back, I told her, reaching across the table to take her hand, is that love creates connections that death doesn't sever. The bonds between us, especially the deep bonds of family, continue. Based on what I experienced, I believe your son is aware of your love, though he perceives it from a broader perspective now, one that understands your grief but sees it within a larger context. We talked for hours that afternoon. I shared the details of my experience, answered her questions as honestly as I could, acknowledged the limits of my understanding. I didn't offer false certainties or sentimental platitudes. What she needed, I sensed, wasn't comforting fiction, but authentic testimony, even with its inevitable gaps and ambiguities. Before we parted, she hugged me tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Not for telling me what I wanted to hear, but for telling me what you actually saw and felt. It helps. It really does. Encounters like this humbled me. They reminded me that the message I'd been given wasn't mine to hoard or intellectualize, but a gift to be shared, especially with those in deepest need. They also reinforced my commitment to speak only from direct experience, not to embellish or expand beyond what I'd actually witnessed during my time beyond the veil. As public interest in NDEs grew throughout the 1980s and 90s, I was sometimes invited to speak at churches, community centers, even medical schools. I approached these opportunities with a mixture of obligation and caution. Obligation to share what I'd learned, caution about the inevitable distortions that occur when profound spiritual experiences are translated into words, concepts, presentations. In 1992, I was asked to speak at a hospice conference in Columbus. The audience was primarily doctors, nurses, and counselors who worked with dying patients and their families. These were professionals who confronted death daily, who straddled the boundary between the clinical management of terminal illness and the spiritual and emotional dimensions of life's end. Standing at the podium, looking out at their attentive faces, I felt a particular responsibility. These weren't just curious seekers or academic researchers. These were people in the trenches, accompanying others on their final journey. What they understood about death would directly impact how they cared for the dying. I'm not here to convince you of any particular interpretation of near-death experiences, I began. I'm not here to promote a religious perspective or to challenge your medical understanding of what happens when the body begins to shut down. I'm simply here to share my experience as one data point among many, as one perspective that might inform your work with patients and families facing death. I described what had happened to me on that Korean hillside, the clinical details of my injuries, the documented period of no vital signs before resuscitation. Then I shared what I'd experienced during that time, the separation from my body, the overwhelming peace, the encounter with deceased comrades, the profound unconditional love, the life review, the reluctant return. What does this mean for your work? I asked them. I suggest a few possibilities to consider. First, your patient's consciousness may be more present and aware during the dying process than physical signs would indicate. The hearing often persists even when other senses have shut down. The awareness may continue even when the body appears unresponsive. I saw nods among the hospice nurses, who had often observed patients apparently responding to voices or presences others couldn't perceive as death approached. Second, the transition itself appears to be characterized by peace, not pain or fear, once the initial resistance is passed. Many of your patients may experience a profound sense of welcoming and release as they cross over, even if the lead up to that moment involves physical suffering. And third, I continued, the connections between the dying and their loved ones seem to persist beyond physical separation. The relationships, the love, the recognition continues, though transformed into something less limited by physical constraints. During the question and answer period, a young doctor raised his hand. As a physician, he said, I've been taught that these experiences are essentially hallucinations produced by a dying brain, the result of oxygen deprivation, endorphin release, and other neurological processes. How do you respond to that explanation? It was a fair question, one I'd heard many times before. I don't claim expertise in neuroscience, I replied. It's entirely possible that certain aspects of NDEs correlate with specific brain states or chemical processes. But correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation. The brain might be behaving that way because consciousness is transitioning, not because it's generating these experiences as hallucinations. I paused, considering how to make my point more clearly. Think of it this way. When you watch television and the picture gets staticky as the signal weakens, you don't assume the static is generating the program. You understand that the program exists independently, and the static represents the receiver's difficulty in processing the signal. Perhaps the dying brain is more like a transitioning receiver than a hallucinating generator. Another hand went up, this time from an older nurse with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. In 30 years of hospice work, she said, I've sat with hundreds of dying patients. Many of them report seeing deceased loved ones in the room, having conversations with people who aren't physically present. Some become radiant, joyful even, in their final moments after periods of great distress. Would you say these are related to what you experienced? I believe they are. I nodded. From what I've heard from other NDE experiencers and from accounts of deathbed phenomena, there seems to be a continuum of experiences around the transition out of physical life. Some people begin to perceive the other side, to see deceased loved ones, to sense the peace that waits before they've fully crossed over. You've been privileged to witness that transitional state in your work. The conversation continued, moving between clinical observations, philosophical speculations, and personal reflections. What struck me most was the genuine openness of these healthcare professionals, their willingness to consider evidence and experiences that didn't fit neatly into conventional medical models, their commitment to addressing the whole person, not just the failing body. Toward the end of the session, an elderly physician who had been quiet throughout finally spoke up. I've been a doctor for over 50 years, he said, his voice weathered but strong. I was trained in an era of strict materialist medicine. If you couldn't measure it or observe it objectively, it wasn't real or relevant to treatment. I've probably rolled my eyes at more spiritual talk than anyone in this room. He paused, looking down at his hands for a moment before continuing. But I've also sat with too many dying patients, witnessed too many inexplicable moments of lucidity just before death, seen too many people describe similar experiences when they've been resuscitated, to dismiss all this as mere neural noise. I don't know what happens after death, but I've become humble enough in my old age to acknowledge that there's more going on than our current medical models can explain. His words hung in the air, carrying the weight of decades of clinical experience combined with hard-won humility. I thanked him for his perspective, recognizing a kindred spirit, someone who had come to understand the limitations of purely materialist explanations, not through mystical revelation, but through honest observation of phenomena that defied such explanations. That hospice conference led to more speaking engagements at medical facilities, to consultations with researchers studying consciousness and survival, to deeper connections with healthcare providers interested in improving end-of-life care. It became another avenue for translating what I'd learned beyond death into practical wisdom for this life. Not just philosophical comfort about what awaits us, but guidance for how we might better support those making the transition. Through all these various roles and activities, teacher, support group facilitator, research subject, public speaker, I remained grounded in my family life. Katie was my anchor, my reality check, my most honest critic and most faithful supporter. She never experienced what I had, never claimed special spiritual insight, but she had an innate wisdom and groundedness that kept me balanced. Sometimes, she told me once after I returned from a weekend conference on NDEs where discussions had become rather abstract and esoteric, I think you all get so caught up in the mysteries of the afterlife that you forget to fully live this life. She was washing vegetables for dinner as she spoke, hands busy with the mundane but essential work of sustaining our physical existence. I recognized the gentle correction in her words. You're right, I admitted, picking up a knife to help her chop carrots. It's easy to become unmoored, to start seeing this life as just a prelude to what comes next. She nudged me with her hip, a familiar gesture of affection. This life is still the one we're living, Jimmy. The garden still needs weeding. The bills still need paying. Our grandchildren still need a grandfather who's present with them, not always gazing into the beyond. It was a wisdom I needed, a counterbalance to the pull of the spiritual that I sometimes felt too strongly. My experience had shown me that this physical existence is temporary, that what we truly are continues beyond death. But it had also shown me that we are here, in these bodies, in these relationships, in this world, for a purpose. That this chapter of our existence, with all its limitations and challenges, has meaning and value. Katie helped me maintain that balance, keeping one foot firmly planted in everyday reality while allowing the other to step occasionally into more transcendent awareness. Our partnership in this life wasn't a detour or distraction from spiritual truth, but an essential vessel for embodying and expressing it. That balance became particularly important as we entered our elder years. Age brought physical challenges. My war injuries caused increasing pain and mobility issues as I moved into my 70s. Katie developed arthritis that gradually twisted her once nimble fingers. We both faced the typical cascade of health concerns that comes with aging: high blood pressure, cataracts, hearing loss, the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. It would have been easy to become resentful of these physical limitations, to see the aging body as a prison from which death would be a welcome release. My glimpse beyond the veil had shown me the freedom and expansiveness that awaits when we shed these physical forms. Sometimes, in moments of particular pain or frustration, I found myself longing for that release. But that would have been missing the point, I came to understand. This phase of existence, including its ending phases, had its own purpose, its own lessons, its own unique form of beauty. The diminishments of age were not meaningless suffering, but part of the complete human journey. I tried to approach my aging with the same consciousness, the same presence that I'd brought to earlier phases of life. To be fully here, even as here, became more physically constrained. To continue learning, growing, loving, serving as long as I remained in this form. Katie's death in 1997 tested this resolve in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Despite knowing what I knew about the continuity of consciousness beyond death, despite believing with absolute certainty that she continued to exist and that we would be reunited, the physical separation was devastating. I missed her voice, her touch, her physical presence, with an intensity that sometimes left me gasping for breath. It's strange. I confided to my daughter Mary some months after the funeral. I know she's not gone, not really. I know death isn't the end. And yet it hurts like hell. Mary finished for me, direct as always. Because you're still here, in a body that remembers her touch, in a house full of her things, in a life you built together. Knowing she continues somewhere else doesn't erase the physical separation. She was right, of course. My intellectual and spiritual understanding of death couldn't eliminate the very human experience of grief. The pain of that separation was real and valid. It was part of this physical existence, this human journey, not a failure of spiritual understanding. I came to see that grief itself was a form of love, a testimony to the depth of connection that had existed and continued to exist despite the severing of physical proximity. I allowed myself to feel it fully, to move through it honestly, even as I held the larger perspective that had been gifted to me in my near-death experience. In the months after Katie's death, I had several experiences that convinced me our connection continued. Nothing as dramatic as visitations or voices, rather subtle moments of presence, of guidance, of what I can only describe as love manifesting across the boundary between worlds. One evening, unable to sleep, I went into our garden. Katie's domain, really. She'd been the one with the green thumb. It was midnight, a clear summer night with stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. I sat on the bench beneath the old maple tree, feeling the weight of absence, of loneliness. "I miss you," I said aloud, not expecting any response, just expressing the truth of my heart in that moment. As the words left my lips, a warm breeze stirred the leaves above me. Not unusual for an Ohio summer night, except that it seemed to wrap around me specifically, like an embrace. And with it came a sense of presence so palpable, so unmistakably Katie in its quality, that tears sprang to my eyes. No words, no vision, nothing that could be objectively verified or documented. Just absolute certainty that she was there, that she heard me, that the connection between us remained intact despite the veil between our current states of being. Similar moments occurred throughout the years after her passing. Sometimes when I was thinking of her, sometimes unexpectedly in the midst of ordinary activities. A particular quality of light through the kitchen window that felt like her smile. The scent of her favorite flowers appearing in rooms where none were present. Dream encounters so vivid and coherent, they seemed more like visitations than ordinary dreams. Were these merely manifestations of grief and longing? My mind creating comforting illusions? Perhaps. I have no objective proof otherwise, but they felt continuous with what I'd experienced during my NDE. The same quality of presence, of consciousness communicating across dimensional boundaries, of love persisting beyond physical form. I shared these experiences cautiously, mainly with my children and a few close friends who would understand. Not seeking validation or trying to convert skeptics, simply acknowledging the ongoing relationship with Katie that had changed form, but not ended with her physical death. My son John, always the more pragmatic of my children, listened respectfully but with clear reservations when I described sensing Katie's presence in the garden. "Dad," he said gently, "you know I worry about you being alone so much. These experiences, they're comforting, I understand that. But you're concerned I'm retreating into fantasy rather than adapting to life without Mom." I finished for him, smiling to take any sting from the words. He nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't offended. "Something like that, yeah. I understand your concern," I told him. "And I'm not abandoning this life or responsibilities. I'm still engaged with my work, with you and Mary and the grandkids, with my friends and community. I'm not sitting around waiting to join your mother." I paused, trying to find words that might bridge the gap between my experience and his perspective. Think of it this way. If Mom had moved to another country, say she was living in France, and we could only connect through occasional phone calls, you wouldn't think it strange or unhealthy that I still felt connected to her, that I sometimes sensed what she might think about something, that our relationship continued despite physical separation. "That's different," he protested. "She would still be alive. She is still alive," I said quietly but with conviction. "Just not in physical form. The essence of who your mother is, her consciousness, her love, her unique perspective, that continues. My experience beyond death showed me that with absolute clarity. I'm not asking you to believe it on faith or because I'm your father. Just to understand that my sense of ongoing connection with her isn't delusion or unhealthy grief. It's recognition of a continuing reality." John didn't argue further, though I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. That was okay. Each person has their own journey toward understanding these mysteries, their own timing, their own path. My role wasn't to convince, but to share honestly, to plant seeds that might germinate when the conditions were right. My daughter Mary approached these matters differently, more intuitive by nature, more open to dimensions beyond the material. She seemed to understand my experiences with Katie without needing extensive explanation. "I feel her sometimes too," she confided during a visit about a year after her mother's passing. "Not the way you do, I think. Just the moments when I know she's close, when I'm making her recipes, when I'm gardening with the girls, when I'm stuck on a decision and suddenly the right answer is just there." We were walking through a park near my home, autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. The air was crisp, tinged with wood smoke, the trees blazing with color against a clear blue sky. "Do you tell anyone else about those moments?" I asked. She shook her head. "Rob tries to understand, but he's practical. And I don't have your credibility. The whole near-death experience, the research studies, the books you've been in. I'm just a middle-aged woman who misses her mother and might be imagining things." "You're not imagining things," I said firmly. "The connection is real. The continuation is real. I know that not just from my NDE, but from thousands of consistent accounts across time and cultures. From deathbed experiences witnessed by doctors and nurses, from after-death communications reported by people with no prior belief in such possibilities. The evidence is overwhelming for those willing to look at it honestly." She smiled, linking her arm through mine as we walked. "That's why we need you to keep sharing your story, Dad. Not everyone has a direct experience like yours. Some of us need witnesses we can trust, Voices that speak truth from direct knowledge rather than wishful thinking or religious dogma. Her words stayed with me, reinforcing my sense of purpose in these later years. As my physical capabilities diminished, as my formal roles in education and research wound down, the essential mission remained: to bear witness, to translate what I'd learned beyond death into terms that might help others approach life and death with less fear, more awareness, deeper purpose. After Katie's death, I had more time to write. I'd kept journals for decades, documenting my ongoing integration of the near-death experience, recording insights that came through meditation, dreams, and the ordinary flow of daily life. Now I began shaping these raw materials into a more coherent form, a book that would tell my story chronologically from that day in Korea through all that followed. I worked on it slowly, deliberately, with no publisher lined up, no deadline, no expectation of fame or profit. This wasn't an exercise in self-promotion, but a completion of the circle, taking what had been given to me and offering it back in the most complete, honest form I could manage. The writing process itself became a kind of spiritual practice. As I revisited each phase of my journey, the near-death experience itself, the difficult recovery, the integration of what I'd learned into family life and career, the scientific research, the public speaking, the grief and continuing connection after Katie's death, I gained new insights about how it all fit together, how each chapter had built upon the last in ways I hadn't fully appreciated while living through them. I finished the manuscript in 2001, just before my 73rd birthday. My children helped me find a small publishing house that specialized in spiritual memoirs and near-death experience accounts. Beyond the Frozen Chosen, a near-death experience in Korea and its aftermath, was published in 2002 with a modest print run of 5,000 copies. The book found its audience slowly but steadily. It wasn't a mainstream bestseller, but it reached the people who needed it most, those who had experienced NDEs themselves and were struggling to integrate them, those who had lost loved ones and were seeking perspective beyond conventional religious platitudes, those who were facing their own mortality and looking for authentic accounts of what might await. Letters began arriving, sometimes at my home address, which the publisher had unwisely included in my bio, more often forwarded through the publishing house. People sharing their own experiences, asking questions, expressing gratitude for the validation and perspective the book had provided. I answered as many as I could, aware that for some, my response might be an important part of their healing or spiritual journey. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a Marine Corps veteran of the Iraq War, a young man named Derek who had been severely wounded by an IED near Fallujah in 2004. He described an NDE remarkably similar to mine: the separation from his body, the tunnel, the light, meeting deceased comrades, the life review, the reluctant return. I thought I was losing my mind. He wrote, "The VA doctors said it was just trauma, maybe PTSD combined with the meds they had me on. But it felt more real than anything I've ever experienced." Then I found your book in the hospital library. Reading about what happened to you in Korea, so similar to what I experienced in Iraq 54 years later, I finally felt like someone understood, like I wasn't crazy, like what happened to me was real and meaningful. He went on to describe his struggles since returning, not just with his physical injuries, but with integrating this profound spiritual experience into a life that now seemed trivial and superficial by comparison. The meaninglessness of things that had once seemed important, the difficulty connecting with family and friends who couldn't understand what he'd experienced, the longing to return to that state of perfect understanding and love. I recognized his situation intimately, the same challenges I had faced after my own return, but without the context and support I'd eventually found. I called him rather than writing back, sensing that a direct connection might be more helpful than words on a page. Our conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. I shared how I had navigated similar challenges, the pitfalls I'd encountered, the practices that had helped me maintain balance between awareness of transcendent realities and engagement with ordinary life. He asked questions no one else could have understood, about specific qualities of the light, about the nature of time in that state, about how to carry the understanding back into relationships with people who hadn't experienced it. The hardest part, he confessed, is the sense that nothing here matters as much as it used to. I know that's not right. I know I was sent back for a reason, but I can't shake this feeling of just going through the motions, waiting to get back to that completeness. I understand completely. I told him, But consider this. If that state of being is our true home, if that's where we all return eventually, then perhaps what matters about this physical existence is precisely what makes it different from that state. The challenges, the limitations, the struggles toward understanding through partial knowledge rather than direct perception, the growing through difficulty rather than existing in perfection. We talked about finding purpose not despite his experience, but because of it. About how his perspective as someone who had seen beyond the veil might help others still caught in fear, materialistic values, or narrow religious concepts. About the possibilities for serving that his unique combination of military experience, near-death insights, and youthful energy might open up. By the end of our conversation, something had shifted in his voice. A new energy, a tentative but growing sense of purpose. "I want to talk to other vets," he said, "especially those struggling with thoughts of suicide. If I could help them understand that death isn't the end, but also that we're here now for reasons that matter, maybe that would make all this worth it." "I think that's exactly right," I told him, hearing echoes of my own journey in his words. "Your experience wasn't given to you just for your benefit, but to be shared with those who need it most." We stayed in touch over the years that followed. Derek did indeed begin working with veterans groups, eventually founding a nonprofit organization focused on spiritual wellness and purpose-finding for combat veterans. He credited our conversation as a turning point in his reintegration and healing. For my part, I saw in him a continuation of the work I had been doing, the message being carried forward by a new generation, adapted to new contexts and needs. As I moved through my 70s and into my 80s, I gradually stepped back from public speaking and formal roles in NDE research and education. The physical demands became too great. Travel exhausted me, speaking for long periods strained my voice and energy. The constant engagement with others' spiritual and emotional needs took a toll I could no longer fully recover from. But the work continued in quieter, more intimate ways. I met with people one-on-one or in small groups when my health permitted. I corresponded with researchers and experiencers around the world. I focused on mentoring younger people who were carrying the message forward in their own fields. Healthcare workers, grief counselors, hospice volunteers, veterans like Derek who had their own NDEs to integrate and share. My grandchildren, 6 of them in all, ranging from teenagers to young adults by the time I reached my 80s, became another focus. They'd grown up hearing abbreviated versions of Grandpa's Korea story, adapted to their ages and readiness. Now as they matured and began facing their own existential questions, they sought more detailed conversations. My oldest granddaughter, Katie, named for her grandmother, came to stay with me for a week after she finished college in 2010. One evening, sitting on the same garden bench where I'd often sensed her grandmother's presence, she asked me directly about what waited beyond death. "I'm not afraid of dying exactly," she said, her young face serious in the fading light. "But I worry about nothingness, about consciousness just stopping, about never seeing the people I love again." I recognized in her questions the universal human concerns that my experience had addressed so directly. Not academic inquiries, but the heart's deepest wonderings about continuity, connection, meaning. What I saw, what I experienced, I told her, contradicts the idea of nothingness completely. Consciousness doesn't end when the body dies. It expands. It's like we're living with severe tunnel vision in these physical forms, seeing only a tiny fraction of reality. Death opens that vision to the fullness of what exists. She considered this, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the weathered wood of the bench. And relationships? The connections between people? Do those continue somehow? Absolutely, I said with conviction. In fact, they become more direct, more complete. Here we're separated by our physical boundaries, by the limitations of language, by our own fears and defenses. There, the connection is immediate, without barriers. You recognize souls you've known and loved instantly, regardless of what physical form they wore when you knew them here. That's why you're not afraid, she said, not a question but a realization. Why you've always seemed so peaceful about it, even after Grandma died. I miss her physical presence every day, I admitted. The sound of her voice, her touch, sharing meals and conversations across the table. Those aspects of relationship are unique to physical existence, and they're precious. But the essential connection between us, between any souls who are genuinely connected, that doesn't end. It can't end because it exists beyond time and space as we understand them here. We talked late into the night, her questions growing deeper, more specific. My answers drawing not just on my NDE, but on the decades of integration, research, and connection with others that had followed. I saw in her not just intellectual curiosity, but a genuine openness to possibilities beyond the materialist worldview that dominated her generation's education and culture. As we finally prepared to go inside, she hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving me platitudes or religious cliches, for telling me what you actually saw and experienced. Just remember," I said, returning her embrace, "my experience is just one data point, one perspective. I don't claim to have seen everything or understood everything. What I experienced was filtered through my human consciousness, my cultural background, my limited capacity to comprehend. There's more, much more, than any single person can grasp." She nodded against my shoulder. "But it's a data point from someone I trust, someone who's not trying to sell me anything or convert me to anything. That matters." Her words echoed what so many had expressed over the years. The hunger not for absolute answers or comprehensive systems, but for authentic testimony. For the simple truth of direct experience, shared honestly with both conviction about what was clearly perceived and humility about the inevitable limitations of that perception. In my final years, as physical limitations increasingly confined me to home, I found myself drawn to deeper contemplative practice. The glimpse I'd been given beyond death had shown me the reality that awaits, but my decades of living with that knowledge had taught me that we can touch aspects of that reality even while still in physical form. Through meditation, through compassionate action, through conscious cultivation of the awareness that sees beyond surface appearances to the deeper patterns connecting everything. I established a simple daily routine. Each morning I would sit in silence for an hour, sometimes focusing on my breath, sometimes on a sacred text, often simply resting in open awareness. I wasn't seeking dramatic spiritual experiences or trying to recreate what I'd known beyond death. Rather, I was practicing being fully present in this moment, this body, this final chapter of my physical existence, while maintaining awareness of the larger context my near-death experience had revealed. These quiet mornings became the foundation of my days. From that centered state, I would move into whatever activities my health and energy permitted. Correspondence with those who had read my book or heard me speak, conversations with family and friends, small creative projects that gave texture and meaning to my increasingly circumscribed life. Physical pain remained a constant companion. My hip, damaged in Korea and replaced twice over the decades, caused persistent discomfort that medication could only partially address. My lungs, scarred from the chest wounds and subsequent infections, made breathing laborious, especially in cold or humid weather. Other age-related conditions added their own layers of limitation and discomfort. I tried to approach this pain with the same consciousness I brought to other aspects of my experience, neither denying it nor being defined by it, acknowledging its reality while recognizing its temporary nature. Not always successfully. I had my moments of frustration, of feeling trapped in a failing body, of longing for release into the freedom I'd briefly known beyond physical form. But mostly, I managed to hold both realities simultaneously, the genuine challenge of physical suffering and the larger perspective that contextualized it within a journey that continued beyond this body and its limitations. As my energy diminished, I focused increasingly on what mattered most: deep connections with those I loved, moments of beauty and wonder in the world around me, opportunities to offer whatever wisdom or comfort my experience might provide to others. I simplified my life, letting go of activities and possessions that no longer served essential purposes, creating space for what remained truly meaningful. My children worried naturally enough. They saw my physical decline, my increasing frailty, and felt protective, concerned about my quality of life and safety. They began suggesting assisted living facilities, home health aides, various interventions meant to extend my independence and well-being. I understood their concern and accepted some assistance: a visiting nurse twice weekly, grab bars in the bathroom, a medical alert system I promised to wear, though I often forgot. But I resisted more intensive interventions, particularly those that would remove me from the home I'd shared with Katie, the garden where I still felt her presence, the familiar spaces that contained our life together. I'm not afraid of what's coming, I explained when they pressed the issue during a family dinner. And I'm not in denial about my limitations. I just want to complete this journey on my own terms, in my own space, for as long as that's possible. My son John frowned. "Dad, we understand that, but we're worried about you falling, about something happening when no one's here to help. You're living alone at 89 with serious health issues. I'm aware of the risks, I acknowledged, and I appreciate your concern. But consider this. From my perspective, the worst that could happen is that I die at home, alone, perhaps from a fall or a heart attack. And death holds no terror for me. None at all. They exchanged looks, concern, frustration, resignation. My daughter Mary sighed. We know you're not afraid of dying, Dad. That's not what worries us. It's the possibility of you suffering unnecessarily, of lying injured and unable to call for help. I reached out, taking one of each of their hands across the dinner table. I understand, and I don't dismiss that concern. That's why I've accepted the alert system, the visiting nurse, your regular checks. But at some point, we have to accept that there are no perfect solutions, no way to eliminate all risk without also eliminating what makes life worth living for me at this stage. I need to be here, in this house, among these memories, with whatever measure of independence I can maintain. In the end, they respected my wishes, though they increased their visits and phone calls, arranged for more regular assistance with household tasks and errands, made sure I had easy access to help if needed. It was a compromise that honored both their love and concern and my need for autonomy and familiar surroundings in my final years. As I approached 90, I found myself increasingly drawn to reviewing my life, not with regret or anxiety about what I might have done differently, but with a sense of witnessing the complete arc of this particular journey, seeing how each chapter had prepared for the next, how even the most difficult experiences had served essential purposes in my development. The near-death experience remained the central reference point, the fulcrum around which everything else pivoted. But I could now see more clearly how it had been both a culmination of what came before, my childhood religious education, my military service, my exposure to death and suffering in Korea, and a foundation for everything that followed. My marriage to Katie, my teaching career, my role in NDE research and education, my approach to aging and loss. What had seemed at times like separate threads, the personal, the professional, the spiritual, now revealed themselves as interwoven aspects of a single coherent journey. The young sergeant bleeding out in Korean snow, the husband and father building a life in Ohio, the teacher guiding students toward deeper perspectives on history, the elder sharing wisdom gleaned beyond death's threshold, all manifestations of the same consciousness, the same soul learning and growing through different phases of a continuous existence. This integration brought a profound sense of peace, of completion. Not that I felt I had achieved all I might have or understood all there was to understand. The glimpse beyond death had shown me how vast the reality is, how much remains beyond our comprehension while in physical form. But I felt a fundamental rightness about how my particular journey had unfolded, a recognition that it had served its purpose even with all its imperfections and limitations. As physical decline accelerated in my final years, as simple tasks became challenging and pain a more constant companion, this sense of completion allowed me to approach the end with equanimity. I wasn't clinging desperately to more time, more experiences, more accomplishments. Nor was I rushing toward death as an escape from physical limitation and suffering. I was simply continuing the journey, step by step, breath by breath, present to each moment as it arose, ready for the transition when it came. I spoke of this approach to my hospice nurse, Maria, who began visiting weekly after a bout of pneumonia left me significantly weakened. She was a compassionate young woman, Filipina by birth, who brought both professional skill and genuine spiritual openness to her work with the dying. You have such peace, she observed one afternoon as she checked my vital signs. Most of my patients, even those with strong religious faith, still struggle with fear as the end approaches. But you seem, I don't know, almost like you're approaching a reunion rather than an ending. I smiled at her perception. That's exactly how it feels. I'm not special or particularly courageous. I've just been given a glimpse of what waits, and that changes everything. She nodded, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around my thin arm. I've heard similar things from other patients who've had near-death experiences. It's one of the reasons I find this work so meaningful. Being with people at this transition point, hearing what they've witnessed or understood about what comes next. As she recorded my blood pressure in her chart, lower than last time I noted from her expression, I asked, "What have you concluded from all the deathbeds you've attended about what happens when we die?" She considered the question seriously, taking her time to respond. I was raised Catholic, so I had that framework to begin with. But what I've witnessed in this work goes beyond any specific religion. I've seen too many people have similar experiences as they approach death, describing the same light, the same welcoming presences, the same sense of peace, regardless of their religious background or beliefs. She adjusted my oxygen cannula gently. And I've seen too many moments that can't be explained medically. People who've been unresponsive for days suddenly becoming lucid just before death, often to speak with someone only they can see. People accurately describing who will be in the room when they die, days before it happens. People knowing exactly when their time has come, even when their vital signs don't indicate imminent death. So you believe consciousness continues? I said, not a question, but an acknowledgement of our shared understanding. I do. She nodded. What form it takes, what exactly happens next, I don't claim to know the details. But that we continue, that death is a transition rather than an end? Yes, I believe that completely. My patients have been my teachers. Her words touched me deeply. This young woman in her 30s from a different generation, different cultural background, different life path than mine, yet arriving at similar understandings through her own direct experience with the dying. It reminded me that the message I'd been given wasn't unique to me or dependent on my particular way of expressing it. The same understanding was emerging through countless channels, countless lives, as humanity collectively expanded its comprehension of these fundamental mysteries. In my final months, as my strength waned and my world contracted to the confines of my home, and then primarily to my bedroom, I found myself increasingly aware of the thinning veil between worlds. The presences I had glimpsed during my near-death experience seemed closer, more accessible, not through dramatic visions or voices, but through a subtle sense of companionship, of being surrounded by consciousness that existed beyond physical form. Katie's presence became particularly vivid, not visible or audible in conventional terms, but unmistakably there. Sometimes as I drifted between sleeping and waking, I would feel her sitting on the edge of my bed, sense her hand resting lightly on mine. Once, emerging from a deep sleep, I heard her laugh, that distinctive laugh I'd know anywhere, as clearly as if she were in the room. I mentioned these experiences to my children when they visited, not to convince them of anything but simply sharing what was happening in my reality. John, ever practical, nodded politely but changed the subject. Mary listened intently, asking questions, seemingly genuinely curious rather than concerned about my mental state. Do you think she's preparing you? Mary asked during one such conversation. Helping with the transition somehow? I think the boundaries are thinning, I said after considering her question. Not just for me specifically, but as part of the natural process as physical life winds down. What I experienced suddenly during my near-death experience seems to happen more gradually for most people approaching natural death. A growing awareness of the larger reality that exists beyond physical perception. I took her hand, feeling the echoes of Katie in her fingers, her gestures. Don't worry about my mind, Mary. I'm not hallucinating or confused. I'm simply perceiving aspects of reality that have always been there, but usually remain hidden from our everyday awareness. She squeezed my hand. I believe you, Dad. I felt something similar sometimes. Not as clearly as you describe, but moments of presence, of connection beyond what makes rational sense. Usually with Mom, occasionally with others who've passed. I used to dismiss those moments, but now, I don't know. They feel real in a way I can't explain. Trust your experience, I told her. That's one of the most important lessons I've learned in all this. To trust direct experience over preconceptions or conventional explanations when they conflict. Not naively or uncritically, but with honest attention to what you're actually perceiving rather than what you've been told is possible or real. As my physical strength declined further and I became primarily bedridden, attended by hospice nurses and my children in rotation, these perceptions intensified. The room sometimes seemed filled with presences. Not just Katie, but others I'd known who had passed. My parents, friends from various phases of life, comrades from Korea, not speaking or interacting in conventional ways, simply being present, available, part of a reality I was increasingly able to perceive as my attachment to physical existence loosened. I tried once to explain this to my hospice physician during his monthly visit. Doctor, Abrams was a thoughtful man in his 50s, scientifically grounded, but unusually open to the subjective experiences of his dying patients. It's not hallucination in the psychiatric sense, I explained as he checked my heart and lungs. I'm not confused about what's physically present in the room. I don't literally see or hear these presences with my physical senses. It's a different mode of perception altogether, like knowing someone is in a dark room with you even when you can't see them. He nodded, listening without judgment. What you're describing is actually quite common among my patients in the final stages, he said, particularly those who are cognitively intact, not on mind-altering medications, and approaching death gradually rather than suddenly. Many report increased awareness of presences, of another reality alongside this one. He put away his stethoscope and sat beside my bed. From a strictly medical perspective, there are explanations involving changing brain chemistry as the body begins to shut down. But I've come to believe those explanations are incomplete at best. They tell us about mechanisms but not meaning. The consistency of these experiences across cultures, across times, across belief systems suggests something more fundamental is happening. I appreciated his perspective, neither dismissing these experiences as meaningless neural noise, nor uncritically accepting them as proof of specific religious or spiritual frameworks. It reflected my own approach, holding the tension between skeptical inquiry and openness to direct experience. What do you believe happens when we die, Doctor? I asked, curious about his personal view after years of accompanying people through this transition. He smiled slightly. 15 years ago, I would have given you the standard medical answer. Cessation of brain activity, end of consciousness, that's all. Now, I've seen too much that doesn't fit that model. Too many deathbed experiences that can't be reduced to hallucination or delusion. Too many cases where patients know things they shouldn't be able to know, perceive events at a distance, demonstrate awareness during periods of documented brain inactivity. He adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. I don't have a comprehensive theory. I don't claim to know exactly what happens or what it means. But I've become convinced that consciousness is more fundamental than we've assumed in modern medicine. That it may exist independent of the brain rather than being produced by it, and that death may be a transition rather than an end. Beyond that, I remain open to learning from my patients, including you. These conversations in my final months, with family, with hospice staff, with the few friends still living who came to say goodbye, took on a quality of summing up, of distilling what I had learned through my near-death experience and all that followed into its essential meaning. What had I learned? What message had I returned with, spent a lifetime integrating and sharing? That consciousness continues beyond physical death. That love transcends the boundary between worlds. That we are more fundamentally connected to each other than our separate bodies suggest. That physical existence, with all its limitations and challenges, serves essential purposes in soul development. That fear of death is based on a profound misunderstanding of what death actually is. These weren't abstract philosophical conclusions, but lived truths that had transformed my entire approach to existence. My brief journey beyond the threshold of death had permanently altered my perspective, allowing me to live more fully present to this life, while simultaneously aware of its placement within a larger, continuing reality. As my body weakened further, as breathing became more labored, as periods of wakefulness shortened, I felt a growing readiness for the transition. Not impatience. I treasured each moment with my children and grandchildren, each sunrise witnessed from my bedroom window, each breath drawn with conscious awareness, but a deep acceptance, a recognition that the cycle was completing naturally, appropriately. My final day in physical form began like many others. I woke at dawn, that liminal time when the barrier between worlds seems thinnest. The room was filled with soft morning light and that sense of presence I'd grown accustomed to. Katie most distinctly, but others too, waiting with infinite patience, neither pulling me toward them nor holding me back, simply being with me in this transition. Mary came early that morning, intuiting perhaps that changes were occurring. She sat beside my bed, held my hand, spoke of ordinary things, her garden, her grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, a book she was reading. I listened, responding when I could, though speaking had become difficult and required more energy than I usually had available. As morning progressed, I felt a subtle shift, a loosening, a gentle expansion of awareness beyond my immediate surroundings. The presences I'd been perceiving became more distinct, more clearly recognizable. Katie's especially, waiting with that blend of patience and gentle humor that had characterized her throughout our life together. John arrived around noon, joining Mary at my bedside. They spoke quietly between themselves, occasionally addressing comments or questions to me. I responded as I could, though increasingly I was moving between levels of awareness, between physical perception and something more expansive, less bounded. The hospice nurse came and went, noting changes in my vital signs, adjusting medication to ensure comfort, speaking gently to my children about what to expect. I heard these conversations as if from a distance, aware of their content but increasingly detached from concerns about my physical condition. As afternoon turned to evening, I felt the final loosening begin, the subtle but unmistakable sensation of consciousness preparing to separate from physical form. Not with fear or resistance, but with the natural rightness of a process long understood and accepted. My children sensed the change. They moved closer, each holding one of my hands, speaking words of love and reassurance. I wanted to respond, to tell them everything was perfect, unfolding exactly as it should, but speech was beyond me now. I could only squeeze their hands lightly, hoping they felt the love and gratitude that filled me. And then the transition itself began. Unlike my sudden, violent passage in Korea, torn from my body by bullet wounds, this was gradual, gentle, like drifting from wakefulness into sleep, but with increasing rather than decreasing awareness. I felt myself rising, expanding beyond the confines of the failing body on the bed. I could see my children still holding my hands, could see the hospice nurse who had returned and stood quietly at the foot of the bed, could see my own physical form, thin, aged, breath slowing, yet with a slight smile on its lips. There was no fear, no confusion, no resistance, only recognition. I'd been here before. I knew this territory. The tunnel of darkness opening to light, the sense of moving towards something both new and deeply familiar. The presences becoming clearer, more distinct as I moved further from physical perception. Katie was there, exactly as I remembered her, but also more. Her essence unfiltered by physical constraints, radiant with recognition and love. Behind her, extending into what seemed like infinity, were others. My parents, friends, comrades from Korea, souls I recognized though they'd worn different faces in physical life. And beyond them, that presence I had encountered before, that perfect understanding and unconditional love that transcends all names and forms, that essence from which we all emerge and to which we all return. I moved toward it, aware that this time I wouldn't be sent back, that the cycle of my physical existence was complete, its purposes fulfilled. As I merged with this light, this love, this ultimate reality beyond all concepts and categories, one final awareness crystallized, a truth so profound yet so simple that it contains all others. We are never truly separated, never truly alone. The boundaries we perceive between self and other, between life and death, between time and eternity, are constructs of physical consciousness, not ultimate reality. In our deepest nature, we are one with each other and with the source from which all emerges. This is the message I died to learn and returned to share. This is the truth that waits for each of us beyond the threshold of physical death. This is the reality that changes everything once glimpsed, even imperfectly, through the narrow windows of our human perception. I died in Korea by machine gun fire. I hovered above the chaos. I returned transformed, and now having lived the life that return made possible, having shared what I was given to the best of my ability, I complete the circle, returning to the light that never ceased to illuminate my path, even in my darkest hours. The journey continues. It always has. It always will. And all of it is held in perfect love.